and welcome to Books and Books. I'm Mitchell Kaplan, and this is a very special night when we present Bob Shacochis with his new book, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul. It's also very special because this event is part of a series of events that we've been doing on live stream. So not only are you here in Coral Gables, but there are hundreds of people out there throughout maybe even the world who are watching this tonight as well. And for those of you out there, if during this event you would like to have a book signed to you and personalized, all you need to do is call the number that's on the screen, and we will be happy to have a book signed and shipped to you, and the shipping will be free. So how do you like that? Anywhere in the continental United States. If you're calling from India, it might be a little bit more. But this is really, Bob is someone, as you know, takes a little bit of time writing his marvelous works. But I can tell you that we at Books and Books over our 32 years feel very connected to him with each one of his books. He's been here. He's been so kind to come to Miami and read at Books and Books and be part of what we all do, which is carry on the literary traditions here. Bob now lives in New Mexico, but his writing career spans so many different locations. I know that he lived in Tallahassee. Did you get your MFA at FSU, or you taught at FSU? Yeah, but you also have a place in New Mexico. I got that a little bit wrong. We got sidetracked a little bit outside, but he teaches at FSU and has a place in New Mexico as well, I should have said. The reviews for this new book, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, have been really remarkable. And it's evoked all kinds of different kinds of comments. And I'll read something that Glenn Garvin wrote in the Miami Herald just this last Sunday in a review that we were talking about before. And I really liked for its obsessiveness. He writes, at 715 pages, with a confoundingly serpentine story that sprawls across 5 decades, 4 continents, and 3 wars, including murders, rapes, and betrayals in numbers that challenge our concept of mathematics, Bob Shacochis' new novel does not lend itself to a precise answer to the question, what's that book about? That's not a criticism, though. With a narrative that gathers steam until it's a compulsion, with characters who fascinated even when they don't necessarily resonate, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul cannot be put down, even as it darts through jungles of politics, theology, and deviant sexuality. I love when Glenn writes about deviant sexuality. It sheds multiple literary skins, neo-noir, Conradian tragedy, even journalism. It eludes categorization, but despite a couple of near misses, it never loses its way or its ability to drag you along with it. In the end, it's a postmodern horror story. And he goes on, and he talks about the fact that by the end of it, you won't let go. You won't want to let go. But before that, he says a couple of things that I thought I would bring Bob up here to respond to, which is really something. I mean, it reminds me of that Woody Allen movie in which someone says something and then about Marshall McLuhan, and they bring Marshall McLuhan out to answer that. Because he says here, but if you can deaden yourself against the occasional scene in which Green Beret captains adorn their orders in the poetry of W.H. Auden, and by sergeants spouting T.S. Eliot, the woman is a wild, deadly ride. And I want to bring up Bob Shacochis, who will answer that and give us a marvelous evening when he talks about his new book. Please welcome Bob Shacochis. So what about that Auden spouting?
Well, I love Glenn's review in the Herald yesterday. It gets pretty curmudgeonly towards the end there. And I've talked to Mitchell outside right before this, and he said I could tell this anecdote and use the language that I just used to speak to him in, which is the language of the Special Forces guy who is the model for the main protagonist in my book, who is Master Sergeant Ebel Burnett. But I just came from Tampa. I'm glad to get out of there alive because two of the models for characters in my book, the FBI guy and the Special Forces guy, live in Tampa, and I've been with them for 2 nights, and I had to crawl away from it all. I'm glad to escape. It was wonderful being with them, but when I was in Tampa, the Miami Herald Review came out, and I emailed my buddy, Lieutenant Colonel Tony, and I said, "You just got taken down in the Miami Herald, man. You're not smart enough to read T.S. Eliot." And he was at my reading last night in Tampa and pulled me aside and told me a story that when he was training to be a ranger, there were pit latrines where 20 guys at a time would go in to take a shit. And no dividing walls between them or anything. Just sit down and look to your left, and there's a guy taking a dump, and look to your right, same thing, on down the line. And he was in there sitting on the commode one day, and he looked to his right, and he said to the ranger trainee next to him, like, "Dude, where did you go to school?" And the guy said, "Princeton." And he said, "Yeah, I thought it might be something like that." And my guy said to this guy, "And I bet you were an English major." And the guy said, "Uh-huh. How did you know that?" And he said, "You're a ranger taking a shit reading T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland." I tell you, this guy I'm talking about, Colonel Tony, is twice as literate as I am, and he had his own book come out last year. And I know so many people in the military who read books like crazy because you're either killing people or bored to death. And when you're bored to death, you do two things: you look at porno or you read a book. And reading books is something that they love. Every time, I know because I've been out there with them, when a care package comes from home, there's some, like Hustler magazine and Catcher in the Rye, and then a little bottle of what's supposed to be tonic water, but was emptied out, and vodka was put back into it. I'm so glad to be here. This is the very first place I ever did a book reading, when my first book came out in 1985. And that's when I met Mitchell, and I've loved him ever since, as Miami has loved him ever since. He started Books and Books and the Miami Book Fair, and I know the world of literature considers him a national treasure, and so proud to know him. But so I should read a little bit, and you already know that there are characters in this book who are walking around in real life around the world. One is the Special Forces guy, and the other is a ex-FBI guy who is you meet earlier on in this book, quite early on. And then I'm going to read you the prologue to the book and then jump ahead a little bit. And the prologue takes place in South Miami as human rights activist lawyers coming back from Haiti. And that also, it has the ambiance for me of real life, because I basically am writing about my friends Gary and Cindy, their neighborhood, not especially their house, because the house in the book has two stories. But when I was writing this section, I was absolutely thinking of their place and neighborhood in South Miami. So here's how the book starts. This is a prologue. It's rather short, but rather, well, you'll see. During the final days of the occupation, there was an American woman in Haiti, a photojournalist, blonde, young, infuriating, and she became Thomas Harrington's obsession. "Why have you never told me the story of this girl?" Harrington's wife asked, dumbfounded, but curious. They stood in the kitchen of their gardenia-scented home in South Miami, finishing the vodka cocktail she had mixed to celebrate his reinstallment into her landscape domain. Its calibrated patterns, everything perfectly in its place except her husband. "Why have you waited until now?" she asked. A pained crinkle etched a border of mystification around the brightness of her eyes. Expecting an answer, she followed him through the house, upstairs to their sun-scoured bedroom, where he began unpacking his filthy clothes. "Here," he said, with a hopeful trace of enthusiasm, "this is for you." And he gave her a gift he had brought from Port-au-Prince, a small but moderately expensive painting by Franz Sefron. And what should he tell her? That he had become too involved with a woman and too involved with the greater infidelities of the world, and would rather say nothing of both. If he told her everything, he imagined, correctly, she would want to leave him, or she would pray for the salvation of his distant heart, which was the salvation of a man in a time and a place and a country, and not the salvation of an immortal self. Because when Americans pray, they pray first that history will step aside and leave them alone. They pray for the deafness that comes with a comfortable life. They pray for the soothing blindness of happiness, and why not? But history walks on all of us, lashed by time, and sometimes we feel its boot on our backs, and sometimes we are oblivious to its passing, the swing of sorrow and triumph through humanity, sorrow, and then finally crippling grief fading to obscurity, which is perhaps why Americans want little to do with history, why perhaps they hate it, why prayer comes easier than remembrance, which is how history knots its endless endings and measures the rise and fall of its breath. And when history swirls around you and passes on, and you inhale its aftermath, the bitterness of its ashes and the bygone sweetness of time, and excrete history into memory, you never quite believe you had once heard its thundering godlike whispering, that you had trembled in the face of its terrible intimacies, and you fell silent. Against this silence, Harrington understood it was possible only to speak to other silences. Why would you choose to expose such ugliness, if not in yourself, then in the world? For 2 years, Tom Harrington did not tell his wife, but now she would hear this story, enough of it anyway, that had so abruptly leaped far, far beyond his ownership, his private collection. And would she know him better afterward? Would she know him as he knew himself? And then what? Would she know him at all? His own story of this woman in Haiti was a fragment at best, it's important to say, but his silence was not meant to spare his wife from a betrayal, at least not of the sort she suspected. But there are many, many betrayals we visit upon one another, their forms infinite, some beyond comprehension, some no more serious than a quick sting. He had kept the story from her simply because he had gotten nowhere with it in his own mind and did not understand his role in its events, nor the meaning of its elements. And he suspected that somehow this story would always slip and tumble into the hole of self-indictment. Yet what had he done that was so wrong? What had he done that was not justified by the behavior of others? What was his sin? He could not grasp it, but in the recesses of his soul he knew it was there. There were things you might say, stories you could tell that would leave you diminished, that might outrage one's sense of conscience or morality with their failings and audacities, their reckless disregard for the well-being of others, perhaps not in every life, though Tom rejected the very nature of innocence. But yes, some stories diminished the teller or shamed him in the eyes of honorable people, and often these stories were never told, or only half told, rife with omissions, as Tom's would be with his wife. They lay quiet yet unpeaceful within the black cave of secrets that was part of anyone's soul, and perhaps their silence was as it should be, the last asylum for propriety, for decency. It's extraordinary, his wife said, admiring the canvas. The gallery on Rue Pétuan had obtained another Zephyrin, larger, more fanciful in its circus of cruelties, that he had wanted to buy for her but never had the chance. Why he told her this he couldn't say, because it was not true. It had simply fallen from his mouth, part of another story he was making up. She looked at him sideways, measuring what she must have imagined to be the careful implication of his voice. "Oh," she said, "do you have to go back?" And he knew that because this was a busy time of the year for her at the office, she'd be unhappy if he was leaving again. "I can't," he said. "I seem to have been declared persona non grata." "Tom?" She was absently pulling clothes from his small canvas bag and tossing them into the laundry hamper, and she froze, gasping, her eyes wide and a hand raised to her mouth. "Oh, my God," she said. "What's on these pants? Is this blood?" Her sweet, earnest face, becalmed by the gentle tides of a comfortable life, filled with a look of mortification. Dutiful wife, instinctive mother, she sniffed at the patch of the stains, repulsed. "They're covered with blood. There's so much of it. Tom, what happened?" Yes, what happened? He would have to tell her something, but he did not know where to begin or where to end, and he did not know if she should ever know, if she should ever know him so well, or how he spent his days when he was away from her. So that's a Tom. That's how the book opens, and then it jumps to chapter 1, and you meet my pal in Tampa, who used to work for the FBI and became a private detective, and then one day had a murder case in Haiti, and asked me to go down there and help him investigate it. Well, I would just be his fixer. I knew where to go and what to do down there, and he just wanted my help. So I went with him, and for the first time in 5 years of thinking about this woman that I'm about to read you about, I knew how to write this book. And God, I was supposed to have marked this, so now I have to, okay. But the fact is, the woman who lost her soul is a real person walking around the face of the earth. I only was around her, knew her, although knew, of course, comes with quotation marks, for about 48 hours in Haiti. I met her just very quickly at a dinner one night at a restaurant where I had walked up to go around the corner, and there was a reporter I knew from the London Guardian, and he was sitting with this beautiful young woman. And she was very moody. I was introduced to her, and she could totally indifferent about who I was or what I was doing. And then so this is autobiographical up to this point in the book, and then Tom Harrington is not me. The Tom Harrington I just read you is not me. But the next morning on the veranda of the Hotel Olafsen, I'm having coffee, and she comes up and says, "Can I sit down?" And she's very moody. She's so beautiful, but she's an unappealing person. She's not, there's no charisma. There's nothing there but sort of grouchy bitchiness, sullenness, whatever. But she's beautiful. So I say, "Of course, sit down and let's have a coffee." And she's sort of quiet, and then she sort of blurts out, "Do you know about voodoo?" And I said, "Yeah, what do you want to know about voodoo?" And I talked to her a little bit about that, thinking, you came to Haiti to be a photojournalist, and you didn't read a book. And then she said, "Do you know any voodoo priests?" And I said, "Right, yeah, I know a bunch of them." And she said, "I want to meet one. Will you take me to meet one?" And I thought, well, I'm not really doing anything today. The invasion and the occupation are over. The election's over. The inauguration's over. I can be sort of a parasite on her beauty for the day. Flirt with her, although that doesn't seem like that could ever go anywhere. Um, and so I took her an hour north of Port-au-Prince to a voodoo temple I knew out in the hinterlands. And so I'm going to read you. I mean, this is basically journalism. This is what happened in the car, except when I go off on the soul. That's not what I did in the car, but basically what happened in the car. A few minutes later, Tom sensed her attention on him and glanced over to see her studying his face. Her lips pursed, but her expression otherwise blank. He looked back at the road and then back at her, and she was still intent on trying to see him, the unflinching scrutiny of a woman who wants to know if she can trust a man. But if that was the case, he wasn't pleased she was taking so long to make up her mind. "What is with it with you?" he said. "I have to ask you something," she said, but as soon as the words left her mouth, she averted her eyes and shook her head, regretting her decision, or perhaps not. Perhaps she intended to be cajoled. He knew not to say anything and waited, but then he gave in and said, "Go ahead, ask." She was looking at her knees, her head bowed, her hair streaming back from the breeze of their open windows, her pained face in exquisite profile, and just then he slammed into a pothole that made her grab the dashboard and jerk herself upright, wearing a new look of determination. "You can't," her name is Jackie Scott. "You can't think I'm silly," Jackie said. Not a plea, but a cool demand. "I don't want you to laugh. If you laugh, I'm getting out of the car." In the back seat is Gerard, who is the Haitian guy. He's the fixer, the translator. He usually is driving, but today Tom wants to drive because he wants to be next to the woman. What was she going to do? Hail a cab? She wants to get out of the car. Tom glanced over his shoulder at Gerard to check his reaction to such a threat coming from such a person in such a place, which was itself reason to laugh, and they lifted their eyebrows at one another in stone-faced amusement. "I won't laugh," Tom promised, and instantly her words rushed out into a question that was a type of falling or jumping, although he did not immediately recognize its nature because he had never met a woman anywhere in the world who was so defiantly literal and without irony. Tom wanted her to be cute, a ditz, a sexy ideologue, a glib bitch, a camera junkie, a news hound, a crusader, anything but this. Literal and seemingly unschooled and tormented and wrapped as tight as you could get before you explode. "Do you think it's possible?" she began. With the drop in her voice, Tom leaned over to hear her better. "You think it's possible for someone to lose their soul?" He made a token effort to ponder the question. "Sure. What do you think, Gerard?" "I don't know," said Gerard. "It's possible, maybe." "You're lying," said Tom. "What kind of a Haitian are you?" Tom grinned into the rearview mirror and then looking over at Jackie. "If there's anybody in this car who believes you can lose your soul, it's the Haitian, not the Americans." "You're not taking this seriously," she said. He thought it would only make things infinitely worse between them if he explained that right now everybody in Haiti was taking this outlandish question quite seriously indeed. The Green Berets, the Hungans, which are the voodoo priests, the Baptist missionaries, the Catholic priest. Any villager in the hinterlands would eventually tell you the village's number one problem was loup-garous, werewolves, coming to their huts at night and stealing their babies' souls, gobbling them up like werewolf vitamins. And then in the morning, of course, the baby would be dead and cemented into the statistical afterlife of Haiti's horrific infant mortality rate. "Just forget it," said Jackie. "Too late," said Tom. He had suspected she was being frivolous and theatrical about matters that did not fare well in casual conversation. He thought she was asking about voodoo again, teasing herself with the undercurrent of its diabolique. But again he had misunderstood her. "Let's start over," he said, "if you actually want to have a real conversation. Do I believe in God?" I could believe in God in Latin or in any other language incomprehensible to me, but I cannot believe in God in English. English exposed everything wrong about our approach toward a supreme being, the core platitudes of the institutions behind the rituals, and I'm not even going to tell you what I think about the politics of religion. So I suppose you might say I believe in the mystery of God, and I don't appreciate anybody fucking with that mystery or trying to grease it for me if I'm having trouble swallowing. Do you want me to go on? He missed her nod, and finally she said quietly, okay. Do I believe in the soul? Yes. What is it? I don't know, and neither do you. An eternal essence within us? Sure, why not? The life force that appears from darkness and re-enters darkness, or here's the happier scenario, appears from light and re-enters light, and is not flesh, and is our single connection to what some of us call the divine or the infinite, or the force behind it all? Do I believe that something like that is in me? Yes, I choose to believe that. Do I believe I can lose it? I don't know. If I lose my shoes at the beach, I can go back the next day and find them, or just go buy another pair. But if I'm at the beach and lose my arm to a shark, that arm's not coming back, is it? When we say someone has lost his soul, what are we saying? That somehow that person has been emptied, that a light has been extinguished at the center of his being. He sold his soul to the devil, we say. What happens to people who lose their souls? They seem to die and be reborn in order to breed horror and misery in the world. Whether they are full of hatred or not, they seem to be without love, loveless, emptied of all love, the enemies of love. Where do those souls go, and are they coming back? Maybe you can buy a new one, but where and with what currency? Penance? A life dedicated to good acts? Am I being serious enough for you, Jackie? And then he sighed loudly with his own frustration, unhappy with his release of words, unhappy that he had even bothered to say them, shadows cast by shadows. She did not shrink from his unfriendly monologue, but instead seemed emboldened. It's me, she declared. I've lost my soul. Now how in the fuck did you lose your soul, Tom said. This confession was absurd and bewildering, and he did not want to hear it, and he did not know what she expected of him, and as far as he was concerned, she was in every sense too young and too affluent to be having a genuine spiritual crisis, something that would pass out of her system like a kidney stone. Naturally, although not painlessly, in another year or two, and even then she would not be 30. I don't want to talk about it, she said. How could you have possibly lost your soul? I am not going to talk about it. Look, metaphorically, everybody experiences fuck metaphors, she said. Fuck metaphors. Her words brittle and sharp and clipped. I'm not talking about my imagination. This is not about the imagination. What she said he didn't understand, yet when he tried again, we all have our demons, he said. He sounded fatuous even to himself. That's not what I'm talking about, she insisted. What in the hell are you talking about then, he said. What is this all about? Believe what you want. All right, Tom said. Look, I believe you. I don't care, she blurted childishly, her hands fluttering upward, and Tom thought, oh, brother, ain't this entertaining, and concentrated on the unimpeachable reality of the road. So they go on. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks a lot. They do go on to that voodoo temple, and it's very easy to find out what happened there. Just read the book. I don't know if there's one. If you want to do a Q&A, or we all go to the bar. And
No, we'll do that
we
afterwards.
send
But
kisses to our streaming internet friends.
any questions out there?
Who believes in the soul? I have a question for you. Who believes in the soul?
I want to know how The flirting worked out.
How the flirting? Terrible. And, so he's a humanitarian do-gooder. As an author, as a novelist, storyteller, what do you do with a person like that? You turn their universe upside down and make them do something really bad where they have to question their own sense of righteousness and their own moral value system. And of course, that's what happens to them. That's what novelists do to do-gooders.
I was fascinated by what you said. You probably don't realize you even said it, but at some point when you were setting up the part of it, you said, this is where I knew I could write this story.
Yeah.
Talk about that for a minute.
Okay, so I met this woman. I mean, that scene I just read you, except for my bloviating, or the character's bloviating, because I really didn't say anything to her. I just said, how the fuck did you lose your soul? Are you kidding me? Is that a joke? Are you joking? And she was very serious. Although when we got to the voodoo temple, everything turns again on its head. But she haunted me. I don't know her name. She's somewhere out there in the world, I think, if the saints have been good to her and she's still alive. It was in 1996. I don't have her name. I forgot it, like within days of meeting her. And yeah, well, but I only knew her for 48 hours, and the name she had, her real name, I don't know. If she walked in here right now, I don't even know if I would recognize her, but I certainly wouldn't know her from her name because I don't know it. But that haunted me. That scene, and then still a little autobiographical at the Voodoo Temple. I couldn't shake it, but I didn't know how to write it. Russ Tills, who was the fiction editor at Esquire during those years, called me up and asked if I had a short story for their summer fiction issue, and I said, I don't, but I really want to write one. And it's the first short story I've wanted to write in many years. And I pitched him the idea, and he said, well, go ahead and write it. But I never did because I didn't know how it was supposed to end or anything. And then really out of the blue, someone asked me if I knew this guy in Tampa, a former special agent from the FBI, who is now a very famous hostage negotiator. And I said, I don't know him. And this woman told me that, okay, but he knows about your work in Haiti and he wants to talk to you. And I said, sure, give him my number. And he called me up and he said, do you know about the road between this place and this place? And I said, yeah. And he said, do you know about the quarry there? And I said, yeah. And do you know about Milan-sur-Mer, the resort? And I said, yeah. He said, is it possible to blah, blah, blah? And I said, sure, it's possible. I said, why are you asking me these things? And he said, I have a client who just whacked his wife in Haiti. And the feds have him in prison in Miami. And he named the statutes that he would be brought home and indicted and taken right to jail on. And he said, so he's my client, he's a scumbag, but what the hell, I'm a working man. Will you go down to Haiti with me? But the minute he started sending me these documents on the murder and a picture of the woman who was murdered, I thought, oh my God. This is a convergence of this haunting of mine with this woman I've only known for 48 hours, and then this murder that I'm going to go down and not help anybody solve, but just sort of be the guide for this private detective. And when his name is Bob Dwyer, he'll love me mentioning it, but his character in the book is called Conrad Dolan. When we were down there, I immediately, even before we went, I realized, okay, now I know how to write my novel. And so I was just like a movie director, producer, line producer will block a scene and stage it and rehearse it. I was doing that the whole time with him. And when he finally saw that section of the first draft of that section, he said, what the fuck? I didn't even see you take any notes. I said, every night when I went back to the hotel room, I, wrote in my notebook for an hour. He said, how could you do that? We were both so drunk. I said, well, I was working. And and he was amazed that I would sort of do that because he kept telling me, when I would say, well, what about this? He'd say, no, you're not understanding the facts of this case. And I said, well, I could give a shit, really. All I know is that there's a murdered woman here on the road, and I'm taking her. So that's the story. Yeah.
One second. Would you stand for a second?
Sorry. Yes. The more I read the story of this young girl in your book, the more I keep thinking about a really scary Wizard of Oz. I mean, her name might be Dorothy.
Yeah, and it is Dorothy, eventually,
Yeah.
in the book.
Yeah.
And she hates her mom for naming her that, but she's Dorothy, although she prefers Dottie, and her dad is the Wizard of Oz.
I thought a kind of Ustashi, Wizard of Oz.
After World War II, we intentionally brought a lot of Nazis over to America to help us out with a few things. One of them being the development of the atom bomb, and we found uses for some other ones of them. And this particular one, who is not a German Nazi, he's a Croatian. He's the son of a Croatian Nazi commander, so he's not really a Nazi himself, but he becomes a Catholic Cold War warrior during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then in the 90s, when we have won the Cold War, he switches over to his real passion, which is the centuries-old conflict between the East and West. He's so happy to be now dealing with Islam, because that's who he has hated all his life for reasons that you would find in the book. And he's a crazy person, like all those guys running our government, or at least some of them.
Any other questions?
Joy.
Here's one. Joy, stand up.
What are your personal feelings about Haiti?
What are
Personal
my personal
feelings,
feelings
yeah.
about Haiti?
Right.
The Haitians are one of the most beautiful nations of people that I have ever met. Universally, except for people who get out of control and get to run the country and play all the games that people play in dictatorships in the third world, and send forth all the horror that the ruling class in the third world usually visits upon the people. But most of the people that I know there are the sweetest, gentlest people on earth. They're just, the Bedouins are so famous for their hospitality. Even if you're their enemy, if you show up at their tent or their camp at night, they will take you in, give you tea, give you food. The Haitians have had their ass kicked by everybody, but their sense of hospitality and, just a general sense of fellowship with the human race is really strong in the Haitian culture, and it's almost not returned by anybody. It's a tragedy that I have yet to understand, but maybe one of the ways to help understand it is when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, I don't give a fuck what anybody else thinks about Barack Obama, but I loved him, and it brought tears to my eyes. And I had the delusion that a lot of people had at that moment, that would create a post-racial society. It was the beginning of a post-racial society in America. And it's been exactly the opposite. We're more racist now than we have ever been in my lifetime. It's extraordinary, since 1965. And I think, that most of the world has not forgiven an island of slaves for winning, and made sure that they didn't get to win anything more. The world has treated Haiti like the Republican Party treats Obama. And it's disgusting. It's a disgrace, and it's happening right before our eyes, and I don't know how you stop it. A few years ago, I was so happy to go to Africa for the first time, and I was working in Mozambique, and the Mozambicans had just slaughtered each other for 30 years in a civil war, first a colonial war, but then a really vicious civil war that was compared to Pol Pot's killing fields. They killed 1 million of each other, and then they just got sick and tired of it. Now they're so tired of war, they just want to be mellow to each other. Make sure you say hi to your neighbor because we don't want any animosity in this country anymore. And those people were so beautiful, and I thought, wow, this is like being in Haiti with its shit together. But and most of the Haitians I know still don't think they've had the revolution they need to become a modern nation, a nation that's not a basket case. It's still ahead for them, but God knows what will happen. Whenever you think you have seen the worst in Haiti, then something else happens. So it doesn't seem to have a bottom. But that's what I think of Haiti. I love Haiti. I love Haitians.
Anyone else? When you were at Iowa as a young student at Iowa,
I wasn't so young. But
well,
yeah.
when you were a student at Iowa,
Yeah.
and you were
Yeah,
studying
I was
there,
younger for sure.
did you ever imagine that your career would be both so journalistically oriented as well as fiction?
Yeah, well,
Is
my
that-
bachelor's degree is a journalism degree from the University of Missouri. Not that they give a shit that I was a editor at Harper's and published journalism wherever, and had an award-winning journalism book. It's like I feel the same about you guys. But I always wanted to do magazine journalism, and that was the sequence. You pick broadcasting or PR, or the newspaper or magazines, and I always dreamed of writing for the best magazines in America, and it just didn't look like it was going to happen. And I was an agricultural journalist in the Peace Corps, writing about banana diseases and the artificial insemination of pigs. And I just looked at, I had 10 years of dues to pay somewhere, and I was also not a copy editor, the copy boy on the Palm Beach Post. Well, actually, it was the Evening Times, and I would pedal down A1A at 3:30 in the morning on my bicycle to get there by 4 when I had to go to work. And my job was to still copy machines of the wire. The stuff would come in one long sheet off the wire, and I had to rip it, off between stories, and then separate the stories into categories, and then go spike it on the appropriate editor's desk. That was my first real journalism job in America. But I always wanted to write for magazines. I thought, this is a really slow road. I don't think I'll ever make it this way. I'll take the bigger gamble, try to make a name for myself as a fiction writer, and then maybe... And when Easy in the Islands came out, I got calls from all the magazines saying, do you do nonfiction? And I'm like, how did this work out? This is backwards. Because usually it's people in newsrooms dreaming of going out and writing, a novel. And I was doing that, dreaming of being, on assignment for Harper's on some important story.
And it worked out.
Well, it's crazy. Not everything in my life has worked out, but that sure did.
Many people in the audience might not know about your whole connection with food and food writing and all of that sort of thing.
Hey.
Talk about that a
I don't
little
know
bit.
if I should say this because I haven't really told my publisher that I'm doing this, but Don't Miss Dissy, my cookbook, Don't Miss Dissy, is about to be reissued. In fact, already you can pre-order it on I know it. You can pre-order it at booksandbooks.com. See, there's nothing I know unless somebody else tells me, and so they're like putting puppet words in my mouth. I really have to remember that. Yeah, I know. I do get this all the time, and oh God. But it's coming out from Trinity College Press. Barbara Ross, you know her? She's fabulous, and she really wanted to do it, and nobody else really wanted to do it. But I used to write the food column for GQ magazine. It was a column called Dining In. I had a photographer friend the first year I started doing this column, a friend in New York City, and she said, "So what are you doing these days?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing this and that, and I'm writing the Dining In column for GQ." She said, "You're writing a Dining In column? Is it a column about takeout?" I said, "No, it's a cooking column," and really it was mostly about my relationship with my wife, who I don't know if I should expose her, because every time I do, she gets in political trouble here. But she's a very famous constitutional lawyer in the nation, and she was just appointed by the president of the Senate to be on a task force that will reform sunshine in the government legislation. I mean, it's really, really good. Charlie Crist loved her. Rick Scott doesn't even know who Floridians are. But it was a column about her that eventually became a book called Domesticity, and it's a fun book.
Else? If not, Bob, thanks.
Thanks
for a
coming, you guys,
marvelous
a lot.
evening. Thanks, man. That's great. Really great. I just hope we don't have to wait so long for the next appearance at
Jesus
Books and
Christ,
Books.
I will really be in assisted care.
if it takes that long.
Yeah.
Anyway, we appreciate Bob coming. Thank you all for watching out there.
Thanks.
And all of you here, run to that counter and buy one of his books.
Jeff, hi.
Go out to
I
the
don't know who
counter.
else is there.
Go to the counter, buy a book, and Bob will be happy to sign it for you right over here. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.